go across state, from Pittsburgh all the way across to the other end of Pennsylvania and go to Philadelphia. We're going to spend a couple of projects in Philadelphia, and Casey, also known as Cassandra, will present the first argument for a project that is in the South Village. She will take us there.
Thank you. Thank you for everyone for being here, and thank you to Carl for all his help along the way, and of course my thesis chair, Julie Gabrielli. All of your insights and advice and support has been invaluable throughout the process. And a special thanks goes to my husband, because he's been feeding me for the past few weeks, and without him I don't know if I would be here. Yes, he is here. So I'm Cassandra Huntington, and I'm a dual degree, a Master of Architecture and Master of Real Estate Development. So you'll definitely see how that has kind of shaped this project. The title of the project is Social Enterprise Development, a preventative approach to homelessness and displacement in Point Breeze, Philadelphia. And so we're going to start out by going into the why behind the thesis, and I'll give you a little background on what is social enterprise development. So doing the dual degree has really made me have an interest in architect as developer and that role, and how architect as developer can have an impact on communities, and really how much the built environment is really shaping people's lives and influencing them. And so I really wanted to explore the idea of how can developers contribute to communities in more than just the economic benefit for both themselves and for the city, but also in the social benefit, and that's referred to as the shared value. And so social enterprise development, it's an overarching idea and concept, and so this specific thesis is an application of this concept, and it's really a testing of its feasibility. And so this specific project is looking at one particular user group in need and testing it on a specific site. So the mission of this testing is to break cycles of poverty and social injustice, and it's really looking at it through the lens of the preventative approach. And the specific user group that I was interested in really servicing is homeless adolescents. And so a part of the thesis is also the capstone portion. And so we do have to do the project in a financial model. We have to do the market analysis and look at realistic partnerships for this. So all of this has been done. I won't be really covering this thoroughly, but if you have any questions about it, you should have some answers. But the good news is that it worked. So I was able to get the financing for this through the right partnerships, and it's using a profit sharing model so that the market rate housing and the commercial aspects, the profits generated from that then support the non-income generating portions to help sustain its operations. So now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the vulnerable at-risk population, in this case being homeless adolescents. So HUD refers to homeless youth as anyone under the age of 24, and this project is specifically focused on people between 18 and 24, the homeless adolescents. And these are more of the unaccompanied youth. So this is a person who has had some sort of issue with their family at home, and they're living on the streets. It's not a child with a family who's homeless. So I just want to specify who really is the target. And a lot of these homeless adolescents are unfortunately coming out of the foster care system because there are a significant amount of people aging out of the foster care system, and then when they turn 18, they're losing federal aid, and at that point in time, they're really not ready to support themselves. And so they're kind of just left to fend for themselves, and it's kind of a bleak outlook where they don't really have the support system of their family, and they don't have the financial means to support themselves, and getting further education is kind of daunting. If they don't have finances to go to college, they may not have even finished high school, they may have dropped out. So the statistics for these people who are aging out of foster care is really staggering, that 20% of them are homeless within 1 year, and 37% are homeless by the age of 24. And Some of the reasons for them ending up on the streets have to do with both structural and personal reasons. So structural being more economic based and being typically more poverty driven versus personal being more of abuse at home, mental illness, substance abuse, things of that nature. But either one of these categories, they're typically involve some sort of childhood trauma. And that started to lead me into looking into the adverse effects of negative childhood experiences and how it relates to a person's health. And so this was a more recent study, and it talked about how it really does increase your risk for negative health outcomes for leading causes of death. And so we've known for a while that the psychological trauma can cause future psychological problems relating to mental illness and substance abuse, but really there is documented evidence that it's not only psychological, but you're also, your life expectancy is decreasing as well. And so this really ties into the idea of the prevention aspect of this thesis. So not only are we talking about prevention of displacement, prevention of homelessness, but we're also talking about preventative health care for these people who need it. And we also, of course, know that impoverished communities also lack equal access to health care. So it's relevant in the community that we're going to be talking about as well. So to talk a little bit about where this thesis is being tested, we are in Philly, as Carl mentioned. In South Philly, if you're familiar with the area, Market and Broad Street being the main axes going through Philadelphia. And this project is located on the northern border of the Point Breeze neighborhood along Washington Avenue. And Washington Avenue, when you look at the figure ground here, you can see it's a very wide commercial corridor coming through the South District. It's comparable in size to Broad Street. And this is really important to note because this area is an industrial legacy area as well. And so there's a lot of industrial properties still on this corridor that are being targeted for redevelopment, which is a good thing, and the city is supporting this, and so is the community. However, there are then the possible negative outcomes that could come from this area being targeted for redevelopment by the developer, because the land is cheaper, and so they want to come in and buy it and produce a lot of luxury housing. And then this community is very worried about the displacement and the changing nature of their community. And so this project really seeks to be a good example and a catalyst for equitable development for this community of Point Breeze. Also, just to know, the access to this site is ideal for a project of this nature. It's very close to Center City, so you have access to Center City Job Corps and then other job corps surrounding in the metropolitan area, and you're well connected through metro and bus route. And so this is just to give you a little bit of a sense of what it's like to walk along the corridor and the types of buildings and the streetscape that you would see. When you're on Broad Street, although it's very wide, it's more pedestrian friendly, and it has a lot of trees and porosity along the street. But because Washington Avenue is this industrial legacy area, obviously it is lacking a lot of these things. It has a very wide corridor, and there's just not a lot of pedestrian scale elements along the street. And so as this redevelops into a more mixed use area, this streetscape should really start to reflect more of what we're seeing on Broad Street, hopefully. So this just kind of gives you that idea of the Broad Street comparison. It has the same number of drive aisles and parking as Washington Avenue, but you can see also that the public right-of-way is much smaller on Washington Avenue. And just something to note about how the massing was really influenced is on the south side of the block is Ellsworth Street, and you can just already see the huge scale change between the Washington Avenue corridor, which is this big commercial and industrial area with these large-scale buildings, and then we very quickly, right on the other side of the block, drop down to the scale of the row home and this one-way street. And so this was a big driving force in the massing and figuring out how to kind of step down to the neighborhood and try to relate to both sides, this large scale and the small scale. So now we're going to jump into more of the massing and the programmatic elements on the site. So this is the existing condition. We just talked about Washington Avenue and we talked about Ellsworth. And so the site is taking up almost the whole block. It's not including the townhomes. And currently on the site, it's primarily warehouse buildings that are holding like construction materials. And most of them are not in the condition worth saving, so they would be demolished. However, there is one warehouse on site that has some nice architectural features and can be restored and preserved for the use of the project. And then this is what we're left with for the buildable area, and you can see that there's an alley that's been cut through just to better access and serve the development overall, and it is not touching any of the private property of the townhomes at all. And so from the beginning, establishing that strong urban edge was really important along the Washington Avenue corridor, and then starting to, again, ease into the neighborhood. And then also, from the beginning, I knew I was going to need to put in some sort of gathering space, green area, and it quickly became clear that this was not going to be on the ground floor. It was going to need to be raised up to accommodate the programmatic needs of the project. And so we continue to kind of step down and ease into the neighborhood. We start to break up the mass to, one, create a through pedestrian street, and to also break down the mass because this block is 400 feet long, so it's very, very big. And again, as we're trying to make this a more pedestrian-friendly area, we really need to start figuring out how to make this not feel so heavy along the street. The connections were also very important to the massing. We'll see very soon in the presentation, there's a lot of different programmatic elements going on here, and so creating these links to all these different uses was key. And then again, continuing to break down that facade along the street to create a more human scale and articulating those bays. And then lastly, creating a series of different outdoor spaces at different levels and different scales. And so here's a quick overview of the program in this project. We have mixed income housing, transitional housing, healthcare, education services and employment training, and retail and commercial space. And so all of the retail and commercial space is on the ground level, and this is where we really start to see more interaction with the public. The interaction with the public was definitely something that was something that was kind of difficult because of the sensitive nature of some of the programmatic aspects, and there needed to be privacy and security, but it also didn't want to feel like it was isolated from the community. And so finding the right balance of when do we let people in and where do we let them in was important to the organization of the building. So the retail and the commercial is within a concrete podium, which is 2 stories, and then sitting underneath just this side of the building, we have 1 level of subgrade parking. And then the second level, still in that concrete podium, we have the healthcare center on the left, and on the right, the education services in the new construction. And then we have employment training in the existing warehouse that has been preserved. Sitting on top of that, now we're into the lightwood framing, and we have transitional housing in the L shape along the back. And this was a smaller program, so we were able to kind of take it away from Washington Avenue, make it feel a little bit quieter, more protected from the street. And then the bigger portion of the program being the mixed income residential sits along that Washington Avenue corridor and houses people between 30% of the area median income all the way up to market rate. And so here we start to see, again, more of that interaction, the areas that can interact with the public at the ground level. So we have restaurant, retail, corner retail, kind of letting people come in and out of the space and activating the corridor. And then we have this through pedestrian street, and we have it also coming through this way. This is an internal link that would probably be used more by the the residents who live here. But it continues that ability to transverse all the way through the site. Then just to note where the entries are for the residences. So the mixed income bar, you would come into this lobby, and then if you're living in the transitional housing L, you come into this lobby. And then in terms of accessing the second floor for the education services, you're entering on the side street. And for the healthcare, you're entering right off of Washington Avenue into this smaller entry, and then you go straight up. And just wanted to note some of the material choices. The materials were chosen in a more diagrammatic kind of way to reflect some of the program. So you'll see on the ground floor with the darker brick, this is really representing more of the public spaces and expressing that interaction. Then the light gray corrugated metal panel is wrapped around the residential portion, and then the lighter kind of red brick starts to express some of the horizontality of where those services are located, both the healthcare and the education services, but it also then links to these outdoor spaces and pops up in the loft spaces of the residential. And so it's really what I needed for that continuity to link all these different programs together and link the facade together to make it feel like one building. And so as you kind of come off of Washington Avenue and start to enter the pedestrian link, this is what you would experience, and making sure, framing the opening of this pedestrian link with the bridge so that you have a view of the warehouse was really important, because the warehouse is a really great feature of the site, but unfortunately it's removed from Washington Avenue. So figuring out a moment that you can see it from the street was really important to the way that this building was laid out. So moving into some of the big ideas behind the actual design for the more particular spaces. So I'm so sorry. Let me just catch my thoughts. So as I was researching more about the homeless youth or homeless adolescents, I started thinking about their needs and how can architecture really respond to the trauma that they've gone through and the healing that they need to have in this environment, and the recovery, the rebuilding, all of these things. How can architecture impact them? And so I started looking at some philosophical ideas and psychological ideas, talking about how we relate to the earth, how we relate to our environment, how we see ourselves as a reflection of what's around us, and some of these things started to influence how I was thinking about the design. And then that kind of continued into, well, does it go further than psychological response? Could it be a biological response? So I started looking into the impact of things like natural light and our biological need to relate to the outdoors and the changing of the light in order for our bodily systems to respond properly and to release the right hormones at the right time. And so all of these things are affecting our overall well-being. And with us spending so much time indoors, I thought this was really important with the sensitive nature of some of the user groups that will be living on the site. And so as I was researching those, I realized that these were kind of components of the bigger idea of biophilic design and our innate human urge to relate to other forms of life and life cycles. And so I did some more research into like the bigger concepts and kind of broke it down into these different requirements for the application of biophilic design. And so we see you need to have repeated engagement with nature, a multiplicity of settings, and an authentic experience of nature. And so this has really been applied to all the different components of this project, although it might be most obvious in the healthcare facility, because that is where we see this healing garden. It really is essential that it was integrated into all the different components of the site. And so to dive into the healthcare facility, I was looking at the very famous study by Roger Ulrich, where he talks about, he measures the biological response in healthcare facilities and hospitals during the healing process, during recovery from surgery. And it was measured that with either a view to nature or physical access to nature, anger and depression was reduced, anxiety is reduced, blood pressure, muscle tension, and recovery time. And so there are real biological responses that we have when we are able to have this interaction with other life forms. So the whole healthcare facility has been organized around this healing garden. And so you can see, this is where you come up from the lobby space, and so you can circulate around this healing garden depending on which area you're going to. And it was also organized around having sight lines going all the way through the space. Number one, for security, so like nurses can have views to all these different areas. And then also just for the concepts of biophilia and bringing in this light, not just surrounding the healing garden, but back in these other corridors where you might not typically receive as much light. And so there's 3 different wings in the healthcare facility. We have the primary care, physical therapy, and behavioral therapy. And here's some views. The healing garden was kind of designed with more of a path through the site where there would be more movement, and then areas for repose along the path. And then kind of these outdoor rooms that have a sense of more enclosure and more privacy coming off of the corridor. And then there's also different spaces such as the group therapy room and the behavioral health room that directly opens out up into a completely private outdoor space that uses cedar trees in order to help divide that space visually. And then other plants have been picked carefully based on things like the aromatic properties of lavender and that it can help reduce stress and anxiety. Echinacea flower, the way that it's a perennial and you can see the changing cycle of this flower with its blooming season, and then it can also be harvested for its medicinal uses. And so this is the moment when you kind of come up from those stairs, from the entry, and you're in the waiting area for the healthcare facility, and you can look out to the healing garden, and you can directly go out there as well. And then also that group therapy room that has the indoor-outdoor connection, that extended space into the private outdoor room. So for the education and employment, as I mentioned, the warehouse is being used as the employment training center. So on the ground floor, we have things that would require larger equipment and things being delivered. So we would have like the wood shop down there. They might be learning about becoming a mechanical technician or a plumbing technician. There can be makerspace with CNC routers and different kinds of printers, and then automation for manufacturing. And then on the mezzanine level, which has been built into the space, we have culinary training on this side of the mezzanine, and then on the south side, you start to have these kind of open areas for gathering, and then you also have some areas for cosmetology. And then on the north side, in the new construction, we have the education services, so you can see the variety of different classrooms, computer labs, meeting spaces, study rooms, and there's also a testing center on site for, not the GRE, GED, thank you, GED, SAT, any types of certification programs to help people get employed. And so this is one of the experience of what one of these classrooms would be like. And you can see the access from the internal corridor. Then there would also be direct access out to that link in between the education and employment services. And this is what one of the teaching kitchens would feel like up in that mezzanine level in the warehouse. And this section really just starts to emphasize that link created between the Employment Training Center and the education services. And it also starts to illustrate some of the outdoor spaces of the residential with the outdoor zone coming off the south side, and then these carve-outs where it creates additional communal areas for outdoor space. And then also noting just the existing structure that has been restored and preserved in the warehouse. And again, the mezzanine level has been built in to the building. And then finally, the last programmatic element being the housing. So in this view, we're standing in one of the transitional housing units, looking out over the healing garden. On your left, you can see the mixed income housing, and then on the right, more transitional housing on that side. And one thing I just want to note about this is that there were different screening ideas implemented to help things feel open but also private. And so that's why we have some of these kind of semi-communal balconies with the screening system. And then we have thicker plantings to help restrict views looking down, from this level right into the healing garden. And then the more outdoor spaces for the transitional housing are also located on the south side, so that there's more minimal balconies looking over onto the healing garden from the right side. And so here we're seeing, this is the mixed income housing and then the transitional housing here. But the mixed income housing, we have all the way from studios up to 3 bedrooms. And this is where you can also start to see the articulation of some of those areas that are carved out, and just the emphasis on that repeated engagement with nature. So that since this is a double-loaded corridor, trying to get more natural light into this space and be a communal benefit for everyone to be able to access these outdoor zones was important. It also helps with wayfinding. It's also an organizational element because they're located specifically by the cores in the same locations. So it just kind of helps with the organization of the building too. And so this is one of those semi-communal balconies with the screening and the mixed income housing. And then for the transitional housing, there's a couple different stages. So the first being, if someone comes into this program, they would come into a single room occupancy. And this is kind of the first step. There still might be possibility for reconciliation, which is always the most ideal outcome. But oftentimes, unfortunately, this is not the outcome. And so this is kind of a time for more intensive therapy, potentially rehab. And then they would move on, if they were staying in this program, to the group home situation. And in the single room, it's just a bedroom with a shared bathroom, and then there's co-live space on each floor. And sorry, just to clarify, this is the single room occupancy portion, and then this is the group home portion. So the group home is a 4-bedroom unit that has a shared living kitchen, and then there's a micro unit that's for a live-in staff. And during the time when they're living in the group home, they would be doing some sort of learning, education or employment training, hopefully getting a job, and once they have proof of income, they would be able to then apply for one of the mixed income apartment units. And so this is the moment that you're kind of walking into the group home and you have this nice, smaller space, kind of front porch that allows for these different size gathering places with connecting to the outdoors. And then you also have this larger gathering space on the roof for the transitional housing. It's really just aiding in helping them form relationships and bond with each other and experience some acceptance and support from other people who are going through similar life experiences. So this project has been an application of the ideas of social enterprise development, and it's really just showing how this project can serve all different kinds of people in different stages of life and different conditions of life. And it's showing how this community can benefit both the higher income individual who might be moving here, it can benefit the lower income existing resident who might be worried about displacement, and it can also benefit the most vulnerable at-risk population, being the homeless adolescent. And also this project overall is contributing to the revitalization efforts of this entire area, but it's also doing it in a way that provides equal access and opportunity for housing and services. Thank you.
So I guess I was going to be the first this time. I have one question before I go to comment. Why keeping that industrial structure? Was there any special, other than this industrial memory, is there any other reason?
The warehouse, you're saying?
Yes.
This corridor, so from the city vision, with the industrial legacy areas, they're interested in redeveloping and revitalizing, but they also want to keep some sort of industrial nature still alive in the corridor. And the plan for this area in terms of zoning and entitlements is that it wouldn't just be rezoned to commercial mixed use, but it would actually be rezoned to industrial residential mixed use. And so it's part of staying within the vision for this entire area. And I've also already demolished a lot, and this seems like, it's like if you can save it, I felt like you should, and since the employment training, I mean, I thought it makes sense.
I think you have done an excellent work in actually responding to both the present and future urban conditions of these places. It's a very sophisticated articulation of the proposed volumes. It's a very skillful work of the grain of the building to smaller buildings that actually works very well from the main street with the bigger buildings to the grain of the townhouses, the rear side of the townhouses, which is where you actually see the grain of the townhouse. Right. And I think that's, from that point of view, this is, a really successful building. The question I have is on what I think seems like an incompatibility between the way you decided to work out your urban form and the way you decided to work out your functions. So you actually have very clearly divided the whole lot into two. Right. And then with the introduction of the new alley that goes through the building to the rear alley. And I understand the presence of this secondary alley that actually separates these, but then you work out the integration. But then the function is very different. You would expect that you mentioned that the rear side of the building, the L side of the building, is going to be the transitional housing. Right. And somehow it's connected with the industrial part. And I can understand why they're not physically connected, even though they're for the same kind of public. Right. But it's hard for me to understand why then these connects, like in this side, connects to that side, because you could have worked out something very similar.
So you're saying the bridge?
No, I'm okay with that. The L actually touching the corner. Here? Which in your floor plan, it's actually reflected on a dead-end corridor that does not connect the other corridor.
You're talking about here?
The last floor.
Oh, wait, where?
There you have. Go
Can
through
you point?
Right the corridor.
Oh,
there you have. There you have.
Yes.
There you have. I'm not expecting an answer. I imagine the situation that drives you to do that, but it's the kind of thing that I will definitely review. Yeah. And then with that, the idea that the whole second floor actually works as one, which works a little against the idea of dividing, because I see the benefits of integrating it, but then it works against the idea of actually physically dividing it. But so there's little things that I don't see very clearly, that your building says something that to me is very clear, but then when I go and see how it works, it doesn't work that way. It works in another way. So those are the comments. The other thing that I think is that you have a vision of this new alley that I think is correct, dividing the big block into two, and a very active dynamics going on, but there's really nothing that drives me back there. Yes. And I do think that your whole, the lobby for the transitional housing is not well placed. You put it in the street. I would have put it there. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think to respond to this kind of leading nowhere, I agree. That was a struggle this whole time, was how to do this through block connection, because I didn't really want it just to end nowhere. So that definitely was a struggle the whole time, and kind of was noted when I did these different parties studies. But I did try to, even though it's not ending somewhere exactly right here, there is kind of a strong connection between what's happening on the ground floor and what's happening in the warehouse. So hopefully there would be a place to go there, because there would be workshops and a showroom. underneath the bottom of this so that there is somewhere to go.
I think it would be stronger if you actually connected with the way you enter to both.
Okay.
But, this is the kind of thing that I will discuss
Yeah.
now with the client, and then we'll keep working. I mean, this is an excellent result, excellent point.
Yeah, thank
I
you.
really commend you. From what I've heard, you were deeply involved in something that it's very, very, I know it's very, very difficult. And I am really happy to see that actually very well reflected here, although I will discuss these little things.
Yes,
Okay?
thank you.
I'm going to let my peers critique this much in the way the first gentleman did. I think there's a lot of fine details that as you go to the next stage, as you said, you could refine. But please allow me to take my time to commend you. And really, everyone who's presented has done an amazing work. But I think that you really have articulated your design in 3 dimensions that I haven't seen thus far. From the study of the functionality, the purpose, the organization of the spaces in 3 dimensions, not just in plan, which is very well thought out in my mind. I can easily see products coming out of the wood shop or the makerspace going into the showroom. I can see cross-pollination of these spaces, the mixed income housing to the transitional housing, bringing those 2 communities together literally and figuratively. Even your thought process of what species are going to grow in the garden, how the healing garden interacts as kind of like a Roman courtyard with all of the surrounding spaces, depressing, elevating. It's extremely well thought out, and your use of the existing architecture, embracing the warehouse industrial environment, but I would say actually softening it, using a culinary studio, bringing the warmth of the woods and just the warmth of cooking as a function into the space is very harmonious. I think that, along with your intervention of these green screens, all of these things are representative. We talk about biophilic design, but I think you're actually executing it quite well. The massing, stepping down to residential scale, you utilize an existing condition to do that, but then you build up around it. So actually, I don't know if that was your thought process, but to me it looked like you were building a mountain back from the residential to the main street, and I think that's actually very thoughtful. You don't have the rendering here, but to one of the points that my predecessor made, you had a rendering on the screen that actually, if you look down the tunnel, you catch the corner of the wood shop. And it's almost like a tease. It's not an ultimate focal point like a chapel bell tower or something. But it is something that could draw you into the space, and if you look in the plan here, you're juxtaposing. You don't have a straight tunnel. So I actually thought that, considering your constraints, that was quite a nice move. I'd love to see this being built, and I rarely say that of Thesis projects. So I just want to commend you. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Beautiful project.
I agree. All of your ideas and your graphics are very compelling. I actually like what you've done with the warehouse as well. I appreciate that you didn't just plow down everything, that you picked something that had some sort of architectural significance in the community, and you held on to it and repurposed it. And it does feel like it has a level of hierarchy. There is a full floor of education. Is it the second floor? Or I guess there's 2 sides. There's the healing side and then the education side, and that kind of gets blended in. I don't feel like it gets lost, but it is very well blended in. But the warehouse stands alone as something that's very important, and you definitely recognize that when you look at this development. I also appreciate the attention to detail when it comes to designing the public spaces. On the ground level, you're providing an area for the people in transition to network with the community at large. And as you step up, you're looking at more intimate connections. They can interact with each other in the large healing garden and in that public kind of balcony space that you designed. So I think that's a really nice touch as well. I think, this is done extremely well, but if I were to critique anything, it would also be the connection or the transition between the median income, the market rate housing, and the transitional housing. I'm wondering if you looked at different models of blending those in different ways. If there was an initial part of your research that encouraged you to separate them, put the transition on one side and then medium and median and market rate housing on the other side. So if
Yeah.
you could elaborate on that, that would be
Yeah,
great.
that went back and forth for a really long time, how integrated they should be, how separate they should be. For some time, there was an idea of actually putting like little townhomes actually on the back of the site and having the group homes kind of reflect the row homes of the Point Bruce neighborhood. And so there was a lot of different ways it was thought about, but coming from more of the security side, it seemed like it would get kind of messy having some more vulnerable populations, especially if some of them are going through some sort of rehab. And just thinking a little bit on the developer side, if there is market rate housing here, it's something that needs to be considered. And so it would have been great to be able to make that connection a little bit stronger, I think, but I think the realities of just the situation kind of came into play. But yeah, I think there's a lot of different models out there that I tried to look at, different precedents of mixed income housing to kind of look at, like Hope 6 projects that have done different types of mixing of incomes, for sure.
Okay. And I think that's fair. The only thing that I might do differently, if you are going to separate them and kind of have this juxtaposition on opposite sides, yeah, that perspective in the middle, and even the far perspective over there, you know, you really see the difference in the way the architecture is articulated.
Okay.
You know, it looks very kind of rich and lush on one side, and then the other side is not so much. You
Yeah.
can very clearly see that there is a difference between the two.
To clarify though, I mean, they do have the same articulation, it's just not seen from the Healing Garden side. So it's not like they're not having the green screen, it's just that's a southern side facade choice. I don't know if that helps. Yeah, so it's,
But it's very, when
but
you
it's
see it in this
noticeable,
perspective, yeah.
I understand, yes.
Feels like
I
a little bit of
didn't-
separation.
Yeah, I didn't think of that.
In this perspective, in the Healing Garden perspective, maybe where we were sort of having the dead end corridor there, maybe that one unit comes out and this becomes an open space or more glassy to kind of just, it's almost like there's that transition that you get to take when you go to the next spot, and that's kind of, maybe there's a little
Okay,
welcome to your, you know, the
Right.
celebratory thing that happens there.
okay.
But that would then start to break up that massing a little bit and repeat the character that you've, you know, so elegantly created across the rest of the space.
Yeah, okay.
I think it's a really fabulous project. There's been so much care to the plan and the section. The drawing, you know, are very beautifully, I mean, we can see it up front, but you can see all of the building materials that are rendered inside of the walls, and so thank you for showing us all of that. The one part that I feel like is not up there yet quite is really this, the front elevations along the main street.
Okay.
And I understand that you're sort of, it brings me back to sort of like horror memories of my own business, but I understand the wrestling with sort of wanting to portray what's on the inside very, very clearly what's on the outside. Sometimes we can't do that.
Right.
Because it makes for a messier product on the outside. So I guess my suggestion to you would be to think about pulling those restraints off from yourself, which is just difficult to do, but and thinking about that elevation in without those restraints on. I mean, I can see it's obviously something that you've worked on a lot. And when you take on a project that's so complex sectionally and plan-wise, it's really hard to sort of pull yourself into this part of it, I think, because there's so many other things to think about. So thank you for showing us all of these other wonderful things. I mean, the interior courtyards are really well developed. It's just this, and obviously you're pulling off of context that's either not there or is undercooked, and so it's really challenging for that exterior context to have something to relate to.
Yes.
And on the inside, you're really reaching from within and from your inhabitants, so it makes it much easier.
Right.
So I think this little move where we've all talked about it, but it's very sophisticated. I mean, you can see that you struggled with a couple other different ways down here. That second one in, I feel like is where you made that breakthrough to come to then pull this piece back.
Right.
The only thing I wonder, is there a way to make an outdoor space that's a little bit larger for the wood shop and the tech and the maker space?
Yeah.
Because some of those things can't all be done inside, and so to bring that back out into the community would be...
Right. Yeah, I agree. There was, I guess, only 2 schemes where I was trying to do that outside of the warehouse, and yeah, just trying to get all the program in there was so difficult, so it was something that I lost. But I agree, I originally envisioned it kind of opening up and having some outdoor space related to some of the building and other things going on in the warehouse.
My last thought goes back to, I think, what the first critic said about, where does this pathway go? And one approach might have been to say that you're really connecting it to the residential below, because you're probably, some of that community may be people that are understanding. They may have friends in the community. I mean, obviously, this is, I think this is a local, you're not pulling people from outside of this general area. So one thought would be to say that you're connecting it down to a garden that's further down, or a park, and sort of say, okay, I'm going to blow a couple of these townhouses through, but these are very long blocks, and so you can imagine almost an alley system that's kind of created through there, something further down. So I didn't know if you looked at that just urbanistically at all.
I think if I was going to create a space down there, it would have had to have been something larger that related to the shop, because if it was something too small off of the alley, there was concerns over bad things happening in the alley.
No, I meant like cutting all the way, like if you took these guys out and you went all the way down.
Oh, I
like
thought you were
3
saying
blocks,
making a space kind of...
all the way further down and connected
interesting.
it within the residential network.
I did not consider that. Interesting thought.
I think that your process from large-scale urban to specific building is thoughtful, and maybe the most complete of the 3 that we've seen so far in terms of looking out where I'm starting in the city and then moving down to the individual sites. That's a commendable thing. The bridging buildings, forcing bridges to happen a lot of times, oftentimes creates spaces underneath that aren't wonderful. And I'm not sure that you needed to connect all along the long facade. That seems to be a residual of a firm you may have done a little time with on Van Ness Avenue. It's a recall of something that they did, and they had very specific reasons for doing it. You save yourself a lobby, you save yourself a stair, maybe.
Yeah.
Which is probably the reason that you did it. But
It was.
I'm not sure it makes for great transitional space all the time.
Yeah, I had concerns over the shadow that was going to be cast.
And the through block connection all the way back to the alley. The alleys are not always wonderful places, and the backs of houses are oftentimes pretty ramshackle, not very well kept. So unless there was a compelling reason to do that, I'm not sure you needed to do that. I look at it and I wonder about things like service and how am I getting services on the ground floor to the various component parts. And where's the dumb stuff like loading docks and how do I get trash in and out of this project and all those kinds of things. So I think there was an opportunity also, once you decide to connect on the left-hand side, the ground floor, and terminate this cross-access, not let it come all the way through, that could be an opportunity to also make a space. in a little bit grander space or central space that all the parts and pieces can look down into.
Right.
Couldn't agree more about the elevations both there. It's like the last thing that ever gets addressed. And it's something that, this is a great project. You know, you've done a really nice job. And I would go back. I wouldn't stop. You know, don't stop now. So you're 90% of the way there. And that's I would spend time looking at that and looking at that. Okay. The green wall idea is strong, and I couldn't agree more, by the way, with separating the SRO stuff from the market rate, mixed income, market rate block. Separate them. That's absolutely the right thing to be looking at, is creating a separation of the floors. But I would, for my portfolio perspective, carrying this forward with me for the rest of my life, I would spend more time on those elevations. I think it's a great project, great progression. I am disappointed that as you were talking about the massing, that you didn't pull the models over, because wow, they look pretty good. You know, again, you went from that.
Should I do that now? We've got this over.
Not time today, but boy, that was an opportunity to show off.
I'm sorry. Well, originally they were supposed to be here, and the shelf didn't look good, so I took it off.
It's on rollers. In your explanations also, as you begin to talk about this, you skip the beautiful diagrams, all right? So, you know, you left out some really rich material that could have explained your process of this. And thank you, Matt. Wow, it's even better close. You know, you've got really rich materials. It's great stuff. So.
Thank you.
Could I regress just a second? Because I don't totally disagree with you, but somehow I did both of you. Which is, I think the elevations are not ready, but they're not far from being ready.
Yeah.
So we're talking about moving balconies back and forth, and then that work in the floor plan, and that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Not big deal. Not big deal. Do it. Yes. Not big deal. And then the other thing, I was looking at this thing, and I'm just recommending you that perhaps the alley was not the greatest idea. I think that you do need the street to get to your garage, to your ramp.
Yeah.
But what if the street that goes from there on was a pedestrian street? So you actually go through to round, end up around that building. Period. And so you activate, and then you actually let the fabrication area to go outside.
Okay.
4 sides. Done.
Right, time to revise.
So when you showed your demo stuff, the old building had a piece that was taken off.
Yes.
And it doesn't show in that picture that there may be some width there. Maybe the building on the left could come down a little bit to reinforce what you're saying.
Right. Okay.
And it would actually create an opportunity of integration between the neighbors.
Right.
Seeing what's going on.
Okay.
And the community, the transition community.
Yeah, definitely.
Very good.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't want this to end either. I just want to say that it's been just a tremendous year, really, working with Casey on this incredibly ambitious project. And if anyone can pull it off, it's Casey. I think for me, what is so impressive about this is the way it started was just with, she did tons of research about homeless adolescents and just the deep compassion that she had for their stories and this search for, and this determination there was going to be a place that architecture was going to make it all, not make it all better, but really help improve their lives. And I think that Casey is somebody who has a facility for big picture ideas and sort of visionary concepts, but also just the ability to get in there and integrate all the details to really take that vision to something that is a believable and achievable reality. And I think another thing that she's well served by is just this absolute determination and intellectual curiosity and just persistence to test and test and test. What you see up here feels so inevitable because of just hours and hours and hours and weeks and months of trial and error and going through many, many, many iterations. And that's how you get to this level of resolution. And I just want to kind of point out a couple more things that impressed me about her work is that, being a real estate major as well, just this need for a fresh approach and this kind of human and community-centered approach. A lot of lawyers and business people are in real estate, as you know, and I think there are far too few people with architectural educations and urban sensibilities. So I'm so excited to see where you go with this, and just knowing that that you can understand the kind of the current financial models and funding instruments, and try to find creative ways to make something like this a financial reality as well as an architectural one is just so impressive, and so exciting to see where you're going to take that. So. And just the last point about the materiality and the, really thinking about biophilia, which is kind of an odd sort of science/design discipline that people are kind of finally coming back around to. There's a ton of research on this, just like tons of scientific research studies, and so to see you testing its application, particularly with the population that you're working with, I think is really commendable, and also could grow to be an area of expertise that would make you a very in-demand person. So congratulations, and thanks for involving me in this, and best of everything to you in your future.